Okay, hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about the 2025 movie, The Smashing Machine, but starring Dwayne The Rock Johnson as UFC MMA fighter Mark Kerr, one of the pioneers of MMA. Yeah, I did not like this movie. I thought this movie was one of the worst combat sports films that I'd ever seen because hey Lisa, what's going on? Because the Rock tries too hard. Like one of the reasons I think the Rock sucks as an actor, as the title says, is because you always know that you're looking at the Rock playing a role. Lisa and I watched this together, and each and every time we referred to the character of Mark Kerr, we referred to the Rock, the Rock. So you can't get lost in the role when you're watching a movie by The Rock because you know that's The Rock right there. In order for an actor to be good, you have to be lost in the role. You have to suspend your disbelief. You have to forget that you're watching somebody play a part and actually think, especially in a biopic, that you're actually watching that person on the screen. You know what I'm saying? This was that we talked about this when we did the Michael Jackson trailer of what a great biopic is. When you watch Ray, you forget that it's Jamie Foxx playing Ray, and you become immersed in the life of Ray Charles. Right? You think, oh man, he could have been Ray. That's how good he was. When you watch um Selena, you forget that it's J Lo. You think it's Selena on the screen. That's how good she was in the role of Selena. When you watch Denzel Washington playing Malcolm X, Denzel Washington played the role of Malcolm X so good that people associate the face of Denzel Washington and the characterization of Denzel Washington in the movie as the real Malcolm X and they visualize him in their mind, especially if they're from my generation after Malcolm passed away. That's how good these biopics, these great biopics, were. Same thing with Joaquin Phoenix and Johnny Cash. Same thing with Ice Cube's son and Ice Cube. It's a little bit easier because he's Ice Cube's son, but in general, we weren't thinking that we were looking at actors playing the role of Dr. Dre, right? Daniel Ezra playing the role of Dr. Dre, or O'Shea Jackson playing the role of his father, right? Or Jason Mitchell playing the role of Easy E. We thought we were so immersed in it that we said, you know what, that's a hell of an actor because I forget that he's acting. If I know that he's acting and the acting is so obvious, then that's a bad actor. And not only in this role, not only in a biopic, but in every single role that The Rock has ever played, he's just he's just The Rock doing rock things on screen. Like he's never he doesn't have range like that. He's not a good actor. He's not a great actor, and he's definitely not a good actor. As a matter of fact, I've never looked at a rock movie and said, you know what? That's a wonderful movie. That's an awesome movie. Ever. You know what I'm saying? And this was his attempt to prove that he is beyond an action star. Because since he's been in Hollywood in the early 2000s, they've put him in that role of being an action star. So he thought he'd go the Sylvester Stallone route. Sylvester Stallone created a lane that many have tried to follow, and that is to create a semi-action movie, but put sentimentality into it by making it a fighting movie and showing fighting in both aspects, fighting in the ring, in boxing, as well as fighting, in real life. And what Sylvester Stallone was trying to overcome in Rocky One, the 1976 version, was poverty and lack of opportunity and ostracization by society, in the rough, gritty streets of Philadelphia. What this guy was trying to overcome, Mark Kerr, was drug addiction, and basically a wife played by Emily Blunt that was totally insensitive. So now that that's out of the way, let's explain what this is. A biography movie about Mark Kerr, the MMA fighter. Now, this is based on the 2002 documentary by the same name, The Smashing Machine, about the life of Mark Kerr. And basically, every scene that is in this film is in the documentary too. So basically, what The Rock did was watch the documentary and recreate every single scene in the documentary as himself. You know what I mean? And right off the bat, the movie starts with a fight scene, and the fight scene is Paul Varlins, an MMA fighter, an early MMA fighter. Many wrestling fans will know, fighting against Mark Kerr. Many wrestling fans will know Paul Varlins. He participated in an angle in ECW in 1997. But the guy that he's fighting, that's playing Paul Varlins, looks like a Homer Simpson motherfucker. You know what I mean? Mark Kerr completely destroys him. You know what I mean? Completely annihilates him. And he fucking, of course, he looks like a complete jabroni, a complete loser. Why is this guy even fighting in the octagon? Now, it's given no context whatsoever. It's not giving the context of, okay, well, in the early UFC, they really weren't trained fighters because there was no such thing as mixed martial arts. They were creating something that never existed before, right? So a lot of the fighters that you see in the early, the movie starts out in Brazil, but in Brazil, Japan, and the United States, it was the exact same way. Anybody could enter, anybody could fight in either the octagon or the ring in MMA because there was no such thing back in the 90s of being trained in MMA because MMA didn't exist, right? That's given no context, that's given no exposition. So if you're somebody like Lisa that doesn't know much about the background of MMA and how MMA came to be and the evolution of MMA as a sport, like a lot of the viewers are, you will get you're like, why is this complete nobody, Paul Varlins, supposed to represent Paul Varlins fighting against this obvious professional fighter in Mark Kerr and completely being destroyed? No context whatsoever. So Mark Kerr wins, and then he goes to the back stage area and he's being interviewed, and he basically is saying, talking about how he gets into his mode of fighting. He gets into this mental state, and he's very conceited. He's a very conceited person. In fact, he goes to Japan to fight for Pride FC, and he doesn't even put it into his mind that he will lose. Okay? He's completely arrogant. He's completely conceited. He believes that he's unbeatable. So they show him going to the doctor, and only when he's in the doctor is there a little bit of exposition. There's a conversation between this random lady and him because she's staring at his eye. She's wondering why he's all banged up, and he says, "You're staring at my eye? Are you familiar with the Ultimate Fighting?" And she's like, "Is it like boxing?" So she's supposed to represent the average everyday viewer, questioning what this is, and he says, "It was sort of like boxing, but it combines different disciplines, jiu-jitsu, wrestling." He comes from a wrestling background, collegiate wrestling, not professional wrestling, but collegiate wrestling, real wrestling. We have a video on the channel differentiating the difference. And he basically tells her what this is. And she says, "Isn't that barbaric? I've seen that. I've heard of that. Isn't that barbaric?" And he goes, "Yeah, but, at the end of the day, we still get along. We still, are friends," which there's a friendship in here between himself and Mark Coleman that played by Ryan Bader, that is evident in the movie. So he's just won, and he's talking about his meds, and he gives his insurance, but he's like, you know what? Forget about the insurance. I'll just buy it myself. He says, I don't get punched in the head for it. No, nothing. He's addicted to painkillers. And this doesn't become evident until much later in the film. And he goes to Japan. It's never given context. Again, no context, no historical context. We're like, why is this American guy going to Japan when he can easily fight in the UFC, which he does fight his first match in the UFC, his only match in the UFC. He's like, why is he going to Japan? And he fights it in Birmingham, Alabama. Again, if you don't know anything about the sport and the history of the sport and how the sport was basically criminalized in the 1990s in the United States, you have no idea why fighters had to go to Japan in order to make a living. You know what I'm saying? Like, why is he going all the way that far when he could easily fight in the UFC? You have no idea anything. You know what I mean? Like, no idea about how the sport evolved, no idea about how why the sport was criminalized, the stigma that the sport had, nothing. You know what I mean? It takes completely for granted that everybody knows about how MMA came to be, how MMA was stigmatized, and how MMA fighters were basically driven underground by state legislatures, Democrats and Republicans alike. You know what I mean? So he goes to Japan, and since it's legal in Japan, they have rules. And one of the rules is no biting, no eye gouging, and no headbutting, and no standing over someone, kneeing them in the face. And that's one of the newer rules. So this Russian journalist, because he's fighting a Russian guy, this Russian journalist gets up there and she says, do you mean to tell me that this specific move, which they demonstrate, which a Japanese guy gets up there, a Japanese lady gets up there and demonstrates what the move is, says, you mean to tell me this specific move is outlawed? He goes, the lady goes, yeah, that's the move that's outlawed. Okay, so he's in the ring with the guy. And the guy does the move, and Mark Kerr loses, right? He gets his whole face all busted up. He continuously does the move. Mark Kerr loses. Now, he thought he could never lose, and here he is losing. So he goes to get the pay from the Japanese guy, and there's a problem with his contract. You know, he's not getting what he was contracted because, well, he lost. You know what I mean? And again, no context as to why they would do this. But even so, he lost, and it's prize fighting, so he's getting the loser end of the purse money, as the late Gorilla Monsoon used to say. But no context whatsoever as to why they were as crooked as they were in Pride FC, that they were controlled by the Yakuza, that organized crime had their hands in this MMA organization in Japan. No explanation whatsoever. But because he lost, now he's in pain. So he goes to the doctor and he says, do you have, painkillers? The doctor goes, no, you need an authorization for that. Because again, Japan is a much more stricter country. It's harder to get drugs. See, contrast that with America, where he was able to buy it over the counter and he paid to play. As long as he had the money, he could get whatever kind of painkiller he wanted, right? Well, in Japan, that's not the case. So what do they give him? They give him Tylenol. And he's looking at it like, Tylenol? And this part was improvised with The Rock, where he says, oh, I'm going to need a lot of those, right? And he pops them in his mouth. Because in the real altercation, which they show in the documentary, he didn't say that. You know what I mean? He wasn't as witty. But he goes back to America. They show him, shopping around Japan. He buys this specific bowl vase, right? A vase for flowers that's a bowl. and he's like, "Oh, I don't speak Japanese." The Japanese lady is talking to him. A lot of useless exposition. I don't know what's the point of that. You know what I mean? I know him buying the thing that it becomes a part of the story later on, but there was no need for the whole "I don't speak Japanese." Maybe to show his estrangement, being a gaijin, a foreigner in Japan, in Japanese society, which doesn't really take kindly to foreigners, kind of looks down on foreigners, especially Westerners. Uh, you know, but he goes back to America, Phoenix, Arizona, and he buys, all the painkillers he wants, all the steroids. They show him shooting up steroids, uh, putting the needle in his arm and everything in the bathroom. Uh, and his girlfriend is like, Emily Blunt plays her pretty well, but she's a very unsympathetic character. Like, she's a complete bitch. She is just like, she's only with him for his money and his fame. You know what I mean? Like, she shows no affection to her. She's like, he's completely affectionate towards her. He completely takes her needs into consideration on several occasions. In fact, he has a bout with Roy Rage, and rather than hit her, he fucking uh, tears the entire door down, and like the whole door comes apart like it's fucking made of paper. And she likes these trips. She likes going overseas. She likes going to Japan. Right before his fight, the one that he lost, he had an altercation with her, and that leads to other altercations, later in the movie, because she takes she doesn't take his feelings into consideration at all, and he comes across as this really sensitive muscle man, like he's a complete jock, complete supposed meathead, but you sympathize with him as being this really affectionate, type of guy. Again, he was going for the Rocky thing, what I mean, where Rocky's this fighter and he's this dangerous guy, but at the same time he's really sensitive and he's really loving, and but while he's going for the Rocky type thing, she's no Adrian. She's the completely antithesis of an Adrian. She is all about herself, whereas Adrian, what made her a perfect companion to a hypothetical fighter in a movie was that Adrian was supportive. That, she didn't want Rocky out there fighting, but when Rocky was out there fighting, she was out there fighting with him. You know what I mean? Whereas this girl is just like, if he were to fall off, from the MMA scene, she'd be gone. You know what I mean? Like, they get into a fight when he has to go back to Japan after he tries to commit suicide, right? And his friend, Mark Coleman, is more supportive of him than the wife. Mark Coleman is even like, "You think I come all the way down to Arizona just for fun of it? No, I come to see you. I come to support you." And he has a breakdown right in the hospital bed. And The Rock was really going for the Oscar here in this scene where he has the breakdown in the hospital bed. And the girlfriend's not in the room with him. You know what I mean? She calls the cops for him, but she's not in the room with him at all. So when he gets back on his feet and he has to go back to Japan to fight, he's not taking her with him because he feels like it'll be a distraction, which it was the first time. So, so she's like, "What do you mean you're not taking me with you? What do you mean?" And then like they get into a fight and everything, and she just airs it out. And all of a sudden now she starts drinking. She develops a drinking problem. She's staying out late with friends. You know what I mean? And there's one scene with her and a friend, and she's bitching to her friend about how he's not paying her any attention, and she wants a kid, and he doesn't. He doesn't feel like it's time yet. There's a scene where there's a cactus, and the cactus she didn't attend to it properly or whatever. So he cuts a piece of it off, and he does it really intentively and really softly and really tenderly. And there are times when she fucks up, like when she fucks up with his protein shake or when she fucks up with his cactus. It's like, and he doesn't even get mad. He's like, he gets mad slightly, but he just brushes it off. And this bitch just sits there like she's the ultimate villain of the film. She just sits there and like she starts berating him because he doesn't want kids. First of all, he probably can't have children because his balls are probably shrunken from too much steroids. Secondly, he's recovering from painkiller addiction and he's still fighting. Like, how insensitive could you be, bitch? But rather than snap at her, he's really sensitive with her. Like he's like the ultimate girl's dream guy because he's not snapping at her at all. Like it takes a lot for this guy to finally say at the end of the movie, to finally push back at this bitch and say, you know what, I'm tired of this shit. One time she starts going off, she breaks his vase, she starts throwing shit, and he's in there calling his sponsor from NA, telling his sponsor from NA, listen, what she's doing and everything, right? Because she started using. Now the tables have turned, and she's the user, and he is the person that has to be supportive. She even herself tries to commit suicide, taking his gun and wanting to shoot herself, and also wanting to overdose. And she closes the door, and he has to tear the door down. So, see, when they get really serious, scenes like this take you out of the seriousness. And the way The Rock looks. The Rock looks like, if you're a wrestling fan, you remember 1998, the DX parody. The DX did a parody of the Nation of Domination where Triple H dressed as The Rock. He called him the Croc, right? He kind of gave himself a spray-on tan to make himself look kind of black or half black, and he kind of looked like The Rock a little bit, a parody of The Rock. Well, this is what The Rock looked like. And then later on, he gets a haircut. And then he looks like Batista, the wrestler Batista, or Drax the Destroyer in the Marvel movies. Right? So, like, his look is very distractive. And these kind of jokes, like when he tears the door down and shit, it takes you out of the seriousness of the movie. Because with Rocky, again, that's the standard. That's the fighting film. That and Raging Bull, those two fighting films, and The Wrestler, the three best fighting films of all time. They didn't have, like, there was no scene in Rocky other than the turkey scene with Paulie in the first one, where Rocky did something that was completely funny and you were like, haha, and it took you out of it. It started to do that around Rocky 4. But by then, it became a completely different franchise. But when the first, and likewise with Raging Bull and The Wrestler, Mickey Rourke didn't do something that was so funny that you were like, oh shit, I'm laughing. It completely made you feel this guy's pain as Randy the Ram. Whereas this, it's like as soon as he tears the door down, you're just like, wow, that's some comedic shit. Like, that's funny, So he gets back on his feet. Him and Bas Rutten, another MMA fighter, Dutch MMA fighter, Bas Rutten appears in this, and he's training him, right? And Rock is doing good. And then Bas Rutten has like an attack, right? I thought it was diverticulitis because I know he suffered that as well as Brock Lesnar, right? Which is one of the reasons why Brock Lesnar stopped fighting in MMA and went back to wrestling. You know what I mean? But like, he administers, the heroin and the steroids to Bas Rutten, and Bas Rutten's all right. Which is like, okay, why does he still have drugs around him and he's in recovery? Like, it makes no sense. But anyway, he gets back on his feet and they have the tournament. Now, this tournament is like $200,000 in Japan. This will really set him over the top. But unlike most fighting movies, other than $1 Million Baby, starring Hilary Swank, and The Fighter, starring Halle Berry, in most fighting movies, yeah, he gets back on top and he wins. See, in The Wrestler, it goes to black, so you never see if Mickey Rourke actually wins. But in this one, Um, he loses. He actually does lose. But Mark Coleman goes on to win. You know what I mean? I think, um, and obviously we know that historically in 1997, Mark Coleman becomes the first UFC heavyweight champion. So, like, and then they show like a guy just shopping, and it's Mark Kerr. Mark Kerr, got himself clean. They had a kid. Eventually, they stood together and they reunited, and that was supposed to be their love story. But this movie tried to be Rocky for the MMA world, or tried to be the wrestler for the MMA world. But unlike Rocky and unlike the wrestler, you could not sympathize with this. Well, you could sympathize with the guy, but like the love story wasn't there. The women that were in the wrestler and the women that were in the wrestler in Rocky, they were supportive of their men. Remember, Marissa Tomei in the wrestler, she's there to support Randy the Ram. Randy the Ram in the wrestler is the jerk. Here it's the other way around. Here, The Rock is the good guy. He's kind of the supportive guy, and the woman is the asshole. And in Rocky, neither one was the asshole. You know what I mean? Like Rocky and Adrian is probably one of the best love stories, not just in the fighting genre, but in all of movies in general. But he loses, and they show him the real him. Now, I don't know why this needed to be made. I mean, obviously, it was a good documentary, the documentary that's based on. But it wasn't like, okay, Mark Kerr is probably one of the seminal people in the early evolution of MMA. But, in the 90s when it was super underground. But let's be honest, you could have made a movie about Ken Shamrock. You could have made a movie about Dan Severn. You could have made a movie about Royce Gracie. You could have made a movie about Kimbo Leopoldo. From that early generation, people that were more known in the MMA world from the early UFCs and the pride fighting competitions more so than Mark Kerr. Mark Kerr, why Mark Kerr? Like, what was special about him that he needed a movie warranted about him? The majority of people, the general public, is not familiar with him. By the time MMA became known by the general public, when the rules were Dana White buys the UFC, Dana White and the Fertitta brothers. No, he's not, Lisa. No, Dan Severn is still alive. Ken Shamrock is still alive. Julio Gracie, I believe, is still alive. Don Fry is still alive. A lot of the early generation people of MMA, the early MMAs are still alive. So that's not the reason. I don't know. Maybe The Rock, he owns his own production company. He was impressed by this. You know what I mean? He oftentimes takes on these weird projects. Like this is the second time he's done this in his history. Fighting with My Family, a movie about Paige, a WWE wrestler, and she had a dynasty, from England where her whole family was wrestlers, and that's pretty quirky. Her mom was a wrestler, her dad, her brothers, you know what I mean? And it was about her journey coming from England, wanting to be a WWE superstar. Her brother wanted to be it. She wanted to be it, and her brother wanted to be it, but her brother wanted to be it more than her, and she got picked and the brother didn't. And that's interesting. But if you wanted to tell the story of a wrestling family, you could have did like they did in Iron Claw and told the story of the Von Erichs, or you could have told the story about the Hearts, a wrestling dynasty in Calgary. So there were other stories that were of more famous professional wrestlers that The Rock could have made, but somehow The Rock picked her, and it was another movie by The Rock that flopped. So The Rock picks these little pet projects that are really weird, and and they end up failing. Now, interestingly enough, this was from the same studio, A24, that did Iron Claw. And they did a tremendous job with Iron Claw in the story of the Von Erichs, also creating a movie, making a documentary out of a movie. Making a movie out of creating a movie that was first a documentary. And Fighting With My Family was the same thing. It was a documentary first, and then it became a movie. And so was this, and so was Iron Claw. Now, A24 is coming out with another movie like this year. It's about Sylvester Stallone and the making of Rocky. It's called And I Play Rocky. So, I mean, A24, they do good movies. So I was really surprised about this. You know what I mean? That it didn't do well. It was really no good. Because like I said, the Iron Claw was good. Fighting My Family, although I was confused about why they made it at the time, I felt like it was pretty okay. Queen of the Ring, which we reviewed on this channel, was also good. And I expected the fighting scenes to be a little bit better, because one of the things that makes these type of movies really special, fighting movies about boxing, wrestling, and MMA, is the fight scenes, and the fighting scenes weren't that great. But I was confused as to why. Why Mark Kerr? I remember when Rock announced it, he went to the Jorge Masvidal Nate Diaz fight in Madison Square Garden. Funny, he came out. First time he's ever come out to a UFC crowd. It's Madison Square Garden. It's where he debuted, right? In '96, but they booed him. They booed him in Madison Square Garden. He came out and put the BMF title on Masvidal. And it's like, oh shit, The Rock got booed. It was a UFC crowd. You know what I mean? So they didn't care that he was making the movie. They just didn't like him because he's a wrestler. And there's always that rivalry between MMA and wrestling. Like, they look at him as like a fake wrestler. Fuck this guy, right? Like, who does he think he is coming into a UFC event? But this was not good, in my opinion. One of the worst. Like I said, the three best are of a fighting movie, whether it's boxing, wrestling, or MMA. The three best are Raging Bull, Rocky 1, and The Wrestler. Iron Claw, probably a distant fourth. As far as an MMA movie, I like The Fighter. The Fighter, although that was let me see if that's what that is actually called, because that's what I remember. Oh, no, it's not. It's Bruised. Bruised. The Fighter is another one with Channing Tatum, I think. An MMA movie. like Bruised with Halle Berry, uh, was a good MMA movie. That was basic. That story was kind of like this story. Bruised by Halle Berry was just like this story. Uh, an MMA fighter that can no longer fight, addicted, and then comes back and kind of wins. That has a lot of MMA fight like this. This had a lot of MMA fighters, in it too. It had uh, this had Ryan Bader in it, right? Bas Rutten, and that one there had Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko in it. The Halle Berry one. But Halle Berry did it as the labor of love because she's an MMA fan. Uh, but Lisa wanted me to talk about the and Ali ranks up there too. But Muhammad Ali is such a figure that transcends boxing that I don't even really consider that a boxing movie, even though it was. Cinderella Man is a good one too because that tells the story of James Braddock, a fighter that we don't really know that much, that people don't really know that much about because boxing was so unpopular in the 1930s because of the Depression and because we didn't have a lot of American champions. We had Max Schmeling and Primo Carnero, two Italian champions, and taken over. But Lisa wanted me to mention the movie Christie, I believe it's called, with Sydney Sweeney. And how that movie also a fighting movie about a female boxer. If you guys remember anything about the early days of female boxing in the United States, you remember Christy Martin. Boxers at that time would be kind of on the underground. They didn't. Female boxing still struggles to this day to gain notoriety because, well, um, sexism. But back then, she was like one of the only few. Layla Ali then became a boxer, and she kind of took it to another level. Then you had Clarissa Shields. She took it to an even bigger level. But and she also has a movie about her life as well, Clarissa Shields. I mean, she grew up in one of the worst areas in the state of Michigan, Flint, Michigan. So she's been fighting, forever. Hopefully, she wasn't drinking the water. But yeah, that's what I mentioned her, Layla Ali and Clarissa Shield. But I mean, they struggle in terms of gaining mainstream popularity, Lisa. That's what I'm talking about, compared to MMA fighters. MMA fighters, female MMA fighters, are much more well known, such as the likes of Ronda Rousey, such as the likes of Gina Carano, such as the likes of Cyber Santos. Uh, with MMA because of Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey changed the game for females in the fighting world in MMA. But Christy Martin and them paved the way in terms of boxing. They were one of the first to do it. They were doing it in 96, 97. I remember seeing them on undercards when De La Hoya was fighting Trinidad in 99. But yeah, Lisa mentioned Layla Ali, Josephine Frazier, women like this that paved the way. But Christy Martin was the first. But this movie flopped as well. Maybe it's because people don't like Sydney Sweeney. The Sydney Sweeney controversy with the American Eagle jeans. Uh, you know, Genes are things that are passed on from person to person, and my jeans are blue. You know, and they took that as a white supremacist, racist thing. Alicia says it debuted at 1.3 million after its November 7th release. But again, Christy Martin, although she's a pioneer in female boxing, just like I kind of compare that to Queen of the Ring. We did a review of Queen of the Ring on this channel with about Mildred Burke. She's a pioneer in her field as a woman, but people don't know who she is because unless, unless they follow the sport. You know, women sports in general kind of struggle against the men's sports because people view sports as a manly thing. But in fighting, they really suffer because it's something instinctively. This is why Ronda Rousey, I feel like Ronda Rousey, and I know people don't like her, you know, I know she's really unpopular, but I feel like in the wrestling world as well as in the MMA world, you know, and with good reason, but I feel like even though you don't like her, it's like you can't take away from what she accomplished in terms of, you know, women's athletics and women's fighting in general. You know what I mean? Like here you had a guy, Dana White, who the owner of the UFC at that time outright said there would never be female fighting in the UFC. And then a couple of years later, after he bought out Strikeforce, you know, in the early 2010s, he was changing his tune. And Ronda was this generation's Mike Tyson. You know what I mean? Across the board. You know what I mean? Like she was such a phenomenon. People would tune into her fights. My fiance at the time and me were huge fans at the time. You know, but it was just like fucking Tyson. You know what I mean? Like you would buy a Ronda Rousey fight and then a couple minutes later it'd be completely over. You know what I mean? Because that's how dominant she was. She would get a bitch down and armbar. She didn't do knockouts. You know what I mean? Like she was more of a grappler because she came from the Olympics out of jiu-jitsu. Second generation, her mom was a judo. She came out of judo. Second generation, her mom was a judo player. And she transitioned from the Olympic pedigree into mixed martial arts, first with Strikeforce and then with the UFC. So she should have had a movie made about her, not the likes of Clarissa Shields and Christy Martin, not taking anything away from them. But I mean, that's like making a movie about, I don't know, Joe Calzaghe. You know what I mean? Joe Calzaghe retired in 2009, 2008 as an undefeated fighter in his weight class, but nobody knows who he is. So what's the point? Again, like Mark Kerr. You know what I mean? There were pioneers in MMA that they could have made a documentary about. Tito Ortiz could have had a documentary made about him because of the way his life was, especially him. Chuck Liddell, for example, right? I would argue that Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz were some of the first stars of the modern MMA wave. Forrest Griffin. Stephan Bonnar. Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar, the season finale of the first Ultimate Fighter in 2005. That's what took the sport. That's what reinvigorated the sport back again. After it was banned, they did the rules modifications, like I was saying, and Lorenzo and the Fertitta brothers and Dana White purchased it in the year 2000, and then they remodified the rules and they legalized it in some states, especially in Las Vegas. And basically, they decided because reality TV was so popular in the early 2000s that they were going to make a reality TV show about it on Spike TV, coming on after Monday Night Raw. And basically, after Monday Night Raw started to suck, people started to watch that instead of Monday Night Raw, or watch or they would watch Monday Night Raw and then watch that after, and they were like, "Oh shit, MMA!" And a whole new generation of people discovered the UFC once again. And in the finale, they had that bloodbath with Stephen Bonner and Forrest Griffin, and that basically reinvigorated the sport. But it was but even before that, though, it was already gaining traction in 2001, 2002, when Ken Shamrock left WWE and came back to the UFC and had the feuds with Tito Ortiz, and Chuck Liddell had feuds. So those stories could have been told, how MMA came to be, because the origin story of MMA is so unique. You know, the history of MMA, how MMA came to be. Basically, it has its origins in the 1800s in the country of Brazil. Brazil, like every other country in the Americas after slavery ended, imported Asian people from Asia, Asian indentured laborers, Asian migrants. Other people imported them from China, Trinidad and Guyana, imported it from India and Pakistan. But Brazil imported a lot of people from Japan. And one of the immigrants, Masudo Maeda, who was a master in jiu-jitsu, which is a samurai art going back ancient times in Japan, he teaches the Gracie family jiu-jitsu, and they modify it and they create what they call Gracie jiu-jitsu or Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And then in the 1920s, they start to create tournaments, the Vale Tudo tournaments, the no holds barred tournaments, the Gracies do, because they believe that this martial art that they've developed and modified, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, out of Japanese jiu-jitsu, is superior to every other martial art. So they create what they call the Gracie Challenge. And it becomes huge in Brazil, right? And even like in the early days of television in Brazil, it becomes popular. And so popular that it's taking over everything else. But then it gets banned in Brazil, like it got banned in the United States. And because somebody dies and it gets taken off Brazilian TV and replaced by professional wrestling, Brazilian professional wrestling, telecatch. But it doesn't die out. Antonio Inoki, who later becomes a professional wrestler and one of the co-founders of New Japan Pro Wrestling, he also spends time in Brazil, and he immigrates to Brazil for a while, and he learns jiu-jitsu, and he learns shoot wrestling from his mentor Karl Gotch, a German wrestler, a German professional wrestler who wasn't making it popular in professional wrestling. So he went to Japan and he taught them the art of catch wrestling, the real wrestling, the origins of professional wrestling. He taught them that. And he taught also Antonio Inoki. So Antonio Inoki takes what he learned in Brazil and what he learned from Karl Gotch, takes it back to Japan, and he starts to have what they call these mixed matches. To the point, in 1976, Antonio Inoki actually challenges in these mixed matches, just like the Gracies are doing in Brazil. Antonio Inoki decides he's going to do it in Japan as well. And he challenges people from, just like they were doing. They were challenging boxers, they were challenging judo players, they were challenging karate guys, kung fu guys, all kinds of different talents and techniques. He decides he's going to do the same thing in Japan, but he's going to do it to the greatest fighter that ever lived, Muhammad Ali. So in 1976, Muhammad Ali, the boxer, has a match with Antonio Inoki, the wrestler. And it's boxer versus wrestler, and it's real. It's no fake shit. Originally, when Ali went into it, he thought was going to be some fake shit because he grew up liking wrestling. He grew up admiring professional wrestlers like Gorgeous George and Classy Freddie Blassie. So he thought it was going to be some fake shit. It was some real shit. And it was the first mixed martial arts match officially that American people saw, because they've been doing it in Brazil, they've been doing it in Japan, but they never did it in the United States. It sucked because the rules were modified. Like Antonio Inoki's a wrestler, he couldn't even grab Ali. So he had to just lay on his back and kick Ali in the shins, because the Nation of Islam had threatened Antonio Inoki that if he grabbed Ali, they would do something to him. So Inoki got scared, and that's all Inoki did. And it kind of sucked, but it planted a seed in the United States. The idea of having two people from two different disciplines, fight each other. And then fast forward to 1993, a gentleman by the name of Art Davies, living out in California. By this time, the Gracie family from Brazil had immigrated to the United States, and they set up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu dojos in California. And Art Davies goes to one. And he's like, man, he sees these tapes of the Gracie challenges from Brazil. And he's like, man, if we could bring that to the United States, that would be awesome, right? People would really get like that, because both boxing and wrestling at the time, those two things had the pay-per-view market cornered. Pay-per-view, like they would do concerts sometimes, they would do religious shows like Easter plays and stuff. But really what dominated pay-per-view and movies, what dominated pay-per-view was wrestling and boxing. But both of those were suffering in 1993. Vince McMahon was on the steroids trial. WCW was in between owners because Bill Watts had been fired and Eric Bischoff had yet to take over with his vision for WCW. And boxing was suffering because Mike Tyson had gone to jail, and he was the biggest draw in boxing, and there wasn't really anybody else in the heavyweight division anyway. So both boxing and wrestling were suffering. So Art Davies saw an avenue. He saw we could use this, we could do this Gracie challenge shit in America and create a unique pay-per-view. So he creates the Ultimate Fighting Championship, a tournament of different guys from different disciplines. But he had a boxer in there, he had a wrestler, he had a sumo wrestler, he had a savate guy, which is a French martial art, he's the guy who ended up knocking a guy's teeth out in the front row. And the way he marketed it was like wrestling, but real. You know what I mean? And all of a sudden, Horace Gracie shocks everybody, because just like in Brazil, where the Gracies dominated, he then dominates. And he's this little ass guy in this little ass martial arts gi. Everybody thinks he's gonna lose because he's facing off against experienced boxers, experienced wrestlers, experienced jiu-jitsu. Experienced sumo wrestlers, right? Emmanuel Yarborough and stuff. And Ken Shamrock was a former professional wrestler who went to Japan, because again, they were doing it in Japan first, right? First in New Japan Pro Wrestling, which was Antonio Inoki's wrestling promotion. But then in the 1980s, the first Tiger Mask, which is this guy's gimmick, Satoru Sayama leaves professional wrestling, and he decides to create a real version of wrestling called Shuto wrestling, like real wrestling, like mixed martial arts, basically. Right? And Ken Shamrock becomes a part of that. So Ken Shamrock, while he's in Japan as a professional wrestler, he starts to compete in that. Which was called the UWFI. So he's already had experience in what would become MMA, so he's in the first UFC tournament, and him and Gracie get to the finals, right, in the early UFCs. And this thing becomes, just like it became in Brazil and became in Japan, this thing becomes a phenomenon. This thing is like, everybody's talking about it. Like, yo, you heard about this UFC shit? It's not like boxing, as boring as boxing, and it's not like wrestling, it's real, right? All the kids are talking about it on the playground. The tapes are popular. Guys are becoming stars like fucking Dan Severn and Tank Abbott, right? They're becoming household names, these guys. And all of a sudden, by 1997, this gets wind of the government gets wind of it. John McCain, and keep in mind, John McCain's wife, Cindy, has dealings with a beer company that is tied to a boxing promotion. And this UFC thing that's new on pay-per-view, a new kid on the block, is outselling boxing. It's outdoing boxing because it's more exciting. You know, you can defeat your opponent in different ways, not like boxing, just standing there, right? So boxing is starting to say, wait a minute, we're losing money. And Cindy McCain, being connected to this boxing promotion, she'd be losing money. So John McCain comes out, and John McCain says, this is human cockfighting. You know, this is barbaric. Somebody could die in there, because the original tagline was UFC as real as it gets, you know, and if somebody dies, so what? You know what I mean? And it wasn't completely no holds barred. That wasn't the case. That wasn't true, because you couldn't, in the original UFC, you couldn't headbutt, you couldn't eye gouge, and you couldn't bite. It wasn't completely no holds barred like they were saying. That was just a way to sell the pay-per-views, right? But John McCain brought into the hype, and then he went around and he convinced every state legislator to outlaw them. So by the time Joe Rogan signs with the UFC in like 97, the only place that they could hold their pay-per-views was in Dothan, Alabama. Like the promotion had been driven underground, and Art Davies eventually sold it to the one who produced the pay-per-view, the company that produced the pay-per-view, SEG, Bob Meyerowitz. But Bob Meyerowitz was about to sell it too by the time Dana White and the Fertitta brothers got a hold of it. Now, Dana White was a guy, he was a trainer. He was originally doing he was going to produce celebrity boxing. He always had this dream of getting into the boxing world. But, and he was living in Boston, Massachusetts, but he got into some issues with the Winter Hill Gang, which is the famous Irish mafia in Boston. Whitey Bulger, the famous Irish mafia guy, Whitey Bulger. So he was ran out of Boston to Las Vegas, where he had family out there, and he spent some of his childhood out there. And you know, that's when through handling Chuck Liddell, he originally didn't like the UFC. He felt it was barbaric too, but then he became converted to it, like the Apostle Paul to Christianity, you know, and then he became its chief apostle, and he and the Fertitta brothers purchased the UFC in 2001, and then the rules got modified, and then again, like I was saying, he had the idea for the Ultimate Fighter, and through reality TV and through the connection of WWE, they had to, Spike TV ask Vince McMahon if he'd allow this Ultimate Fighter to come on his TV after his program. Initially, Vince didn't see it as competition, but eventually, again, it became so popular that once again, just like in the 90s, it became popular to the point where nobody was watching wrestling anymore. Wrestling, UFC was completely dominating pay-per-view again. You know what I mean? So it was resurrected. Like a story like that and how MMA came to be would be so much more interesting than just focusing on Mark Kerr, because there's a conversation. There was a conversation between Dana White and Vince McMahon where Vince McMahon tells Dana White, why would, you know, of course I don't want you on my network. Why would anybody want to watch my fake fights when they could watch your real fights? You know, and that proved to be true. When after MMA became popular in the 2000s and the 2010s with the likes of first Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Quentin Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, and then Brock Lesnar leaves the WWE in 2004 to join the NFL, fails in the NFL, gets cut from the Minnesota Vikings, and then goes to the UFC and wins the UFC Heavyweight Championship from Randy Couture. Randy Couture is another guy, Randy the Natural Couture, that they could have made a movie about. So, and then the audience from WWE kind of jumps over completely to UFC. They kind of get converted over. And as WWE becomes more childish, UFC becomes the adult alternative. And oddly enough, Dana White builds this up as an empire, and then in 2016 sells his company for billions of dollars to William Morris Entertainment, which eventually becomes Endeavor. And then by 2023, WWE and UFC merge, and they form the conglomerate today that is TKO. So the history of this sport is very interesting. The first new sport that was ever invented in the 20th century. Other sports, they came about, well, basketball, football, they came about in the 20th century too, but in the latter part of the 20th century. And as far as fighting, in the 20th century, because boxing came about in the 19th century with modern boxing with John Graham's Chambers devised the Marks of Queensberry rules, right? But even then, like the last real boxing fight that involved grappling took place in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1898 between Jake Kilrain and John L. and the great John L. Sullivan. So like this was a sport that was created before our very eyes in modern times. And that's cool. You know what I mean? Like that's something you would never kind of expect. And the first hybrid sport ever, like combining wrestling and boxing and jiu-jitsu and every type of, and Muay Thai and everything. And before it was like different guys from different disciplines, masters of different disciplines, taking on each other. But it eventually evolved into a discipline all its own. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next video is coming out. People look down on it because of the type of people that they associate with it. You know what I mean? Like rednecks, neo-Nazis, reactionary right-wing types, and the political commentators like Jake Shields that are MMA fighters, and then become these right-wing reactionary guys. They don't do it any favors because, but and the fans are perceived as racist, and their links to Donald Trump and the friendship that Donald Trump and Dana White have with one another, and the fact that they're having a UFC event in the White House ballroom, you know what I mean? So that's the reason why they kind of look down on UFC and MMA and even the whole TKO organization, because they're links to Republicans and right-wingers and reactionaries. But it's a really cool sport. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button. See my next videos coming up. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. And overall, this movie sucked, and I give it uh, a 7 out of 10. You know, The Rock tried, but I just don't see The Rock as a serious actor. I'm sorry. And if he ever becomes a serious actor and I'm proven wrong, he's given the role of a lifetime that could kind of be his breakout role as a serious actor. You know, maybe it'll happen someday, but I don't think so. Really, no action star besides Sylvester Stallone has really broken out of that mold and become that serious kind of actor. Arnold Schwarzenegger has tried it on several occasions, and even he failed at it. You know, Hulk Hogan, come on, Hulk Hogan was one of the worst actors ever. And for the same reason, it's like we could never see Hulk Hogan in a serious way, in any type of way. Like whether it was Thunder in Paradise, whether it was No Holds Barred. Like there's a scene in No Holds Barred, the 1989 movie that was produced by Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan, where his brother's in the hospital because he got beat up by Zeus, and he's supposed to mourn him. And it's serious, but it's really comical as well. So anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Peace.